What is beauty truly, a gift, or the most dangerous curse a soul can carry? From the ancient world of Greek mythology, whispered across centuries in marble halls and moonlit amphitheaters, there comes a story that asks this very question. A story the Greeks believed so deeply, so painfully, that they built it into the bones of their civilization and wept for it long after the fires went cold. There was a woman whose face, they say, launched 1,000 ships, but behind that breathtaking image lies something far more haunting, a tale of gods interfering with mortal hearts, of a golden apple and a fateful choice, of love indistinguishable from ruin. Two great civilizations would tremble. Heroes would fall like autumn leaves. And at the center of it all, a queen, radiant, silent, contested, whose very existence became the world's undoing. Welcome to the story of Helen of Troy. Now lie back, breathe slowly, and let the ancient world take over. The Eurotas ran shallow at dusk, its surface the color of cooling bronze, and Leda knelt at its edge to fill a clay jug she had carried from the palace. The reeds smelled of wet silt and crushed green stem. She did not hear the great white swan arrive, only felt the sudden displacement of warm air against her cheek, and looked up. It stood taller than she expected. Its orange beak caught the last of the light. She did not move. It did not move. The jug slipped from her fingers and struck the riverbed with a dull, hollow knock, and the water closed over it. Nine months later, the child came at midnight. The oil lamp guttered in the corner, its wick drowning in tallow, but the chamber did not darken. Something else gave light, the egg itself, pale as river-smoothed quartz and faintly warm to the touch, the size of a sleeping cat curled tight. Leda had carried it through every season, without knowing what to call what she felt. Pride threaded through with dread. The shell split. The midwives leaned in, then stepped back. The infant inside was not glowing, not exactly. She simply drew the eye the way a flame does, absolutely and without permission. One woman raised her forearm across her face. Leda reached in and lifted the girl herself. Days passed before Tyndareus held her. He stood in the shaft of white morning light that fell through the high window, the infant cradled against his bronze-pinned cloak. Her weight was unremarkable, less than a helmeted head, less than a full wineskin. He had held children before, but Helen's eyes were already open, gray and still as quarried marble, and they found his face without searching. Tyndareus did not look away. He did not soften either. His thick thumb moved once across her cheekbone, a surveyor's gesture, not a father's, and his jaw tightened with something that was not quite pride and not quite fear, but occupied the same territory as both. Years passed, the way they do in Sparta, under hard sun, on stone pavement worn smooth by sandals and cartwheels. Helen was 17 when she walked through the agora, a clay oil jar balanced against her hip. The sesame vendors had the loudest corner, and the smell of roasting cumin from the bread stalls carried across the square. She moved through it all, and the noise dropped section by section, like torches being snuffed in sequence. A merchant stopped mid-count, coins sitting forgotten in his open palm. A soldier's spear rang against the pavement. An old woman looked up and pressed a hand to her own chest and wept without knowing why. Helen did not pause. She had learned not. Word reached Theseus before he had even dismounted. He came at dawn with 12 horsemen, dust rising off the dry road in pale copper columns behind them. He rode through the city gates without slowing. The sentries stepped aside because Theseus was Theseus, and men like that do not stop. Helen was in the street when they found her. His horsemen boxed her in before she could turn. Theseus reached down, gripped her forearm, his hand wide enough to close almost entirely around it, and lifted her onto the saddle in front of him. No word spoken. The city shrank. The sesame stalls, the stone pavement, the old women and their quiet weeping, all of it fell back into the dust and the distance. Helen did not scream. She held her clenched fists against her knees and watched Sparta disappear, her jaw set, her eyes dry. She had been taken. She noted it, the way you note a door swinging shut. Three weeks later, Castor and Pollux came for her. They rode through the Athenian gates at speed, torchlight catching the bronze of their breastplates as they passed. Two compact figures, side by side, identical in the set of their jaws. The sentries raised their spears. Pollux rode straight through the gap between them without slowing. Castor's horse clipped one man's shield on the way past, and the wet, percussive clang of it rang out across the stone courtyard. They found Helen in the upper room where Theseus had kept her. She crossed to them before either could speak, wrapped an arm around each neck, and pressed her face between their shoulders. Castor's leather breastplate smelled of horse sweat and road dust. She gripped the back of his tunic with both fists and held. Neither brother said a word. Pollux pressed the back of one wrapped hand briefly to her hair, once, then let it fall. Back in Sparta, the suitors came. They filled the great hall shoulder to shoulder, kings, princes, and generals from Mycenae, Athens, Ithaca, Crete. Their laughter and bronze cups and competing voices pressing against the stone walls, like a tide against a cliff. The oil lamps burned low between the tables, their smoke carrying roasted meat and spilled wine and the particular sour warmth of too many men in one room. Helen sat at the high table beside Tyndareus and watched. She watched the way each man glanced up at her and then looked quickly away. She watched her father's hand move across the table, counting, calculating, fingers tapping once on the wood. She understood, the matter being decided, not the one deciding. That night, Tyndareus did not sleep. Odysseus found him in the corridor outside the great hall. The compact man from Ithaca, who had watched the feast from the room's edge, saying little, eating less. He carried his oil lamp low, so the light fell on the stone floor rather than his face. Every man in that hall, Odysseus said, without preamble, believes he deserves her. The one you don't choose will go home nursing that belief. Tyndareus said nothing. He knew where grievance lived in men. Bind them first. Make each suitor swear, before you name any one, to defend whoever Helen chooses and to punish any man who violates that choice. The lamp between them guttered once. Tyndareus's plain gold ring caught the light as his fingers closed slowly around his own wrist, a man measuring something he could not see. He agreed. Three days later, the hall was full of crushed white hyacinth. Helen moved through it slowly, the wreath of myrtle and dried pomegranate resting between her palms. Cool stems, a faint waxy smell, the small hard weight of the fruit against her thumb. Menelaus stood waiting. Red auburn hair, broad shoulders, that permanent slight frown that was not cruelty, but caution. He had not tried to impress her. He had simply, each time she crossed a room, moved to where she would not be crowded. She set the wreath on his head. Her hands did not tremble. That was the truest thing she could offer him. Steadiness returned, for steadiness given. Not love, not its opposite. He looked at her and did not pretend the wreath meant more than it did. She was grateful for that and sorry for it, both at once. Years into the marriage, on an afternoon in early autumn, Helen stood at the terrace railing with Hermione warm and heavy against her shoulder, the particular weight of a sleeping child, dense as wet clay, smelling of milk and sun-warmed wool. Below, the plain stretched gold and copper, the Eurotas a dark thread through the fields. She pressed her lips to her daughter's hair. For a moment, one specific, chosen moment, she let herself believe the inheritance had passed her by. That she was only this, a woman on a terrace, a child breathing slowly against her neck, the smell of turned earth rising from the valley as the light failed. She almost believed it. Far from that terrace, on a night Helen could not have imagined, the gods feasted on the summit of Mount Pelion. Torch smoke rose through cool mountain air smelling of pine resin and roasted meat, and the stone table ran long beneath an open sky. Hera sat straight-backed at its head. Athena kept her spear upright beside her, its butt resting on bare granite. Aphrodite laughed at something, low and unhurried. Then the torchlight caught a new figure, wiry, dark-robed, moving without sound through the edge of the feast. Eris set the apple down. Smooth gold, barely larger than a fist, it landed on the stone with a single clean, resonant knock. The inscription faced upward for the fairest. 3 pairs of hands reached across the table at the same moment. Eris stepped back into the dark and smiled. She had not moved far. In the shadow beyond the torchlight, Eris watched the 3 hands hover, each unwilling to withdraw. She reached forward once more, one finger extended, and nudged the apple a quarter turn. The inscription caught the nearest flame and held it, each carved letter filling with orange light. For the fairest. She smiled, not at the apple. At the cost of the word fair, how much blood it could hold without spilling a drop. Far from there, and lower than the gods, a young man moved between his sheep on the damp slopes of Mount Ida. Paris worked slowly, the way a person does who has nowhere pressing to be. The morning air carried pine resin and wet wool. His crook caught a ewe by the hind quarter, easy, practiced, and he crouched to check the hoof, pressing his thumb into the soft cleft of it, feeling for stones. He found nothing wrong, released her. He did not know he had been born a prince, did not know a prophecy had sent him here. He knew the slope, the flock, the particular gray of this mountain before the mist burned off. That was all he knew, for now. Then the light changed. Not cloud shadow, something else. A brightness that arrived sideways, landing in the clearing the way a coin lands flat on stone. Hermes stood at the tree line, winged sandals still. Caduceus held loosely at his side, the twin gold serpents catching the noonlight. He said only, 3 goddesses, 1 judgment, yours to make. Paris straightened slowly. The crook was still in his hand, smooth ashwood warm from his grip. He looked at Hermes. He looked at the 3 figures stepping into the clearing behind him, tall, radiant, each watching him with the patient attention of something that has never been refused. His stomach dropped the way it does on a steep hillside when a step finds nothing. He was a shepherd. He knew already that there was no answer here that would not cost him everything. He did not know yet which everything it would be. Hera stepped forward first. She stood close enough that Paris could smell the cold mineral scent of high mountain stone and something beneath it, rich like dark soil turned before rain. Her robe fell in heavy folds, deep blue catching the broken midday light. She spoke of kingdoms, thrones across the breadth of Asia, from the Aegean coast to the far river valleys where men had not yet named their gods, lordship over every road, every harvest, every army that had ever moved beneath an open sky. Paris felt it land in his chest, not excitement. Weight. The particular pressure of a thing too large to hold. His grip tightened on the smooth ash crook at his side. He said nothing. He could not yet imagine being obeyed. Then Athena stepped forward. She did not stand close the way Hera had. She stopped at a precise distance, the distance of a teacher or a blade held flat for inspection. She spoke without preamble. Wisdom, mastery in war, victory in every battle Paris would ever fight. Not power granted from outside, but skill that would live in his hands, his eye, his nerve. She said his name would outlast stone. Paris listened. He did not fidget, but his gray eyes had already moved past her left shoulder, toward where Aphrodite stood, still waiting, saying nothing at all. Aphrodite came close. She did not raise her voice. She bent until her lips were near his ear, and she said, "The most beautiful woman in the world will love you." That was all. Paris felt the warmth of her breath against the side of his jaw before the words arranged themselves into meaning. His hand moved without his deciding. Up, out, offering the apple. She took it. The gold was cool, then instantly warm where her fingers closed around it. The weight left his palm. Above them, the oak canopy filtered the midday light into slow shifting coins across the grass. The sheep cropped somewhere below. Everything continued as it had before. Troy did not yet know what his open hand had cost it. Three weeks later, Paris walked through the great gates of Troy for the first time. He did not know they were his gates. He had come with a question about his birth, a rumor from an old shepherd, nothing more. Priam stood at the top of the courtyard steps in his deep purple robe, and when he saw the young man's face, he went very still. Then he came down the steps. His hands found Paris by both shoulders, and a sound left him that was not a word, low, cracked, pressed out from somewhere beneath speech. Tears moved through the creases of his white beard. From the edge of the crowd, Cassandra screamed. She pointed at Paris with both arms rigid, her black hair wild across her face, and she cried that he was fire, that he was the burning end of everything, that they must send him away now, Before the walls learned his name, the crowd shuffled. Someone touched her elbow. Priam did not look up. He pulled his son against his chest and held him there, one hand pressed flat against the back of Paris's head. Cassandra's voice broke. She was still shouting when the gates swung closed. Months passed before Paris came to Sparta. He arrived as a diplomat, Priam's son, a guest, and Menelaus seated him across the long cedar table with the easy generosity of a man who feared nothing. The lamps burned low between them, the air warm with roasting lamb fat and spilled wine. Then Menelaus called for Helen. She came through the side corridor, and Paris looked up, and something moved, not in her chest, but lower, in the muscle beneath the ribs, a sudden involuntary tightening. She recognized the sensation the way you recognize a smell from childhood, before thought, before language. She sat. She did not look at him again for a long time, but she felt his gaze on the side of her face like the warmth of an open brazier, steady and sourceless. And beneath the gratitude she felt toward Menelaus's oblivious laughter, beneath the relief of a husband who noticed nothing, there was fear, not of Paris, of how precisely this felt like being chosen. Days later, she walked to the harbor before the sun came up. The stone pier was cold through her sandals, so she took them off, held them loosely at her side, the leather straps cutting faint lines across her fingers. The water was black and smelled of brine and old rope and the particular rot of wet timber that has sat too long in salt. The Trojan ship moved on the swell. A slow, rhythmic creak. She stood there until her feet went numb against the pier stones, and she thought, "This is fear." But her feet were already moving. She thought, "This is Aphrodite." But the hands that lifted her hem from the wet dock were her own hands, with her own calluses, her own familiar weight. She walked toward the ship. Behind her, Sparta made no sound at all. 3 days later, Menelaus rode through the palace gates to find the courtyard empty. No steward at the door, no sound from the kitchens. A servant, crossing the far end of the yard, dropped her eyes to the flagstones and did not raise them. Then he saw Hermione, 7 years old, standing alone by the stone basin, trailing one finger through the still water. Not playing, just waiting for something that had not come. He walked through every room. Each one held its furniture, its oil lamps, its folded linens, everything in place, and all of it wrong in the precise way a wound is wrong before it begins to bleed. He reached the terrace last. The railing was sun-warm under his palm. Below, the Eurotas moved between its reeds. She had stood here 1,000 afternoons, He could feel the exact width of the space beside him where she had stood, the particular quality of the air that her absence had made. By nightfall, Menelaus was riding north. He arrived at Mycenae with road dust still white on his cloak, and stood before Agamemnon in the bronze firelight of the great hall. He spoke the name of Tyndareus. He spoke the oath. Every king, every lord who had pressed his palm against that altar stone and sworn to defend the marriage. All of them called. Agamemnon listened with his broad hands flat on the armrests of his throne. When Menelaus finished, a pause fell, not the pause of a man deciding, but of a man choosing which face to show. "We sail," Agamemnon said. He said it too quickly. Far to the east, Helen walked through the Scaean gates. The stone arch rose high enough to swallow the morning sky. Cedar smoke drifted down from the citadel above, and beneath it, the sharper bite of salt air off the Aegean, and beneath that, the warm animal smell of a city already awake. The gates were wider than the whole of Menelaus's great hall. She walked through. The city spread open before her, white towers climbing the hill in tiers, the sound of 10,000 lives overlapping, a child's sandal slapping wet stone somewhere above. Faces turned. A woman in a doorway pulled her shawl across her mouth. A man 2 steps back went still. Paris touched her elbow lightly. She did not stop. The gates stood behind her. She did not look back. By the time she reached the throne room, the morning light was already falling through the high windows in long, pale shafts. Priam did not rise. He sat with both hands resting on the carved arms of his chair, watching her cross the stone floor toward him, and something in his face changed before she had taken 3 steps. Not surprise, something quieter than that. He was old enough to know what ruin looked like. He had buried sons. He had watched cities burn from a distance once and known the smell of them for years after. Still, he looked at her. When she reached the foot of his chair, he lifted one hand, slowly the knuckles swollen and pale, and gestured toward the seat beside him. "Daughter," he said. One word. He meant it, and beneath the warmth of it, buried somewhere in the old cage of his chest, something else moved, small, cold, certain, that he did not name and did not refuse. Across the city, before the priests had lit their morning fires, Hector climbed to the battlements. The stone beneath his palms was cold enough to ache. Below, Troy still slept. Cook-fire smoke beginning to thread upward through the pale air, smelling of olive wood and damp ash. To the west, the sea lay flat and dark. Then the sails appeared. First one, then a dozen, then a line that stretched until it met the horizon and did not stop. White and bronze, catching the first light before Troy did. Hector's hands tightened on the parapet. One breath. Two. He turned from the sea and looked down into the city, the rooftops, the temple steps, the thread of the market road, and his jaw set with a particular kind of resolve that had nothing of hope in it, and nothing of surrender either. Below the walls, the ships had barely stopped moving. Achilles hit the sand before the hull had settled. A single drop from the prow, his bronze greaves striking the wet shore with a sound like a hammer on stone. The impact drove up through his shins and into his teeth. He straightened. The prophecy was not a secret. The first Greek foot on Trojan sand would be the first Greek dead. Every man on every ship knew it. None of them had moved. Achilles knew it too. He stood in the cold, shallow surf, the salt gray water pulling at his ankles, and he felt not fear, not courage exactly, but something narrower, a deep, particular satisfaction. His name would outlast his bones. He had made certain of that in the single second of the fall. Behind him, oars shipped one by one, and the army began to land. Days into the siege, Priam brought Helen to the ramparts. Below, the plain stretched flat and white under the midday sun. Dust hanging still above the Greek lines. "Name them for me," Priam said. His voice was mild. He rested both forearms on the warm stone parapet. Helen named them. That broad-shouldered figure in the lion skin, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae. The compact one circling the edge of the formation, watching, never still, Odysseus. She gave each name cleanly, without hesitation, her voice level as a blade laid flat. Priam listened without interrupting. She had eaten at those men's tables. She had watched them drunk, watched them argue, watched them grieve. She knew which ones were kind to their horses. Priam said nothing when she finished. He only turned to look at her, not with accusation, not with pity. Something quieter than either. She held his gaze. The stone beneath her palms was almost too hot to touch. Three days later, heralds crossed the plain carrying olive branches. The terms were simple. Paris and Menelaus would fight. One death or one surrender, and the war would end there, in the dust between the lines, before another man fell. Helen watched from the parapet. Below, Paris stripped his blue chiton at the shoulder and rolled his neck once. Slowly, Menelaus was already still, shield arm raised, short sword drawn, red cloak dropped in the dirt behind him like something discarded. The gap between them closed. She gripped the warm stone and felt the roughness press into her palms. Paris was fast. Menelaus was heavy and relentless, each step driving forward, each blow meant to end the thing. The sound of bronze on bronze reached her a half beat after the impact. She did not know what she wanted. Both things were true at once, and she did not look away. Then the field was empty where Paris had stood. Menelaus held a bronze helmet by its crest, the red horsehair crushed in his fist, and the head it had contained was simply gone. Not fallen, gone. Helen felt it before she understood it, the particular wrongness of a thing removed without sound. Aphrodite brought her to the chamber herself, not gently. Paris was already there, sitting on the low wool-covered bench, unhurt. The amber light fell across his shoulder in clean stripes through the curtains. He looked up at her with something eager in his face, relief, perhaps, or the beginning of a smile. She looked at him for a long moment. The smile did not arrive. What had curdled in her chest had no name she wished to speak aloud. She had watched Menelaus drag him by the helmet across the dust of the plain, watched the war reduced to one winnable thing. And this was what stood before her. Intact, chosen by a goddess and delivered like an object. She turned toward the window and said nothing at all. Not far from there, Andromache heard his footsteps before the curtain moved. Hector came in, still wearing the bronze helmet, its red crest brushing the low beam. He lifted the boy from her arms, and the child looked up at that great plumed face and screamed. Hector laughed, a short, surprised sound. He reached up with both hands and unlatched the helmet, setting it on the floor with a heavy, resonant clang against the stone. The boy went quiet. One small fist closed around his father's thumb. Andromache watched Hector's face in that moment, all the armor gone from it, just a man holding his son in fading amber light, his thumb completely captured. She loved him and feared for him. Both were exact, and neither moved. He held the boy a long time before he set him gently down and reached for the helmet. Across the plain, the Greek fires were burning low. Agamemnon's herald had already gone. The tent flap was still moving. Achilles stood in the sand with his fists at his sides, watching the woman led away. Briseis, her dark braid catching the firelight one last time before the dark swallowed her. He had not spoken. He did not speak now. He sat down on the cold sand outside his tent and pressed the heels of both hands hard against his eyes. Inside, he told his captains he would not fight, not tomorrow, not for Agamemnon, not for any oath made by other men on other shores. And the Greek lines which had held for 9 years, began, slowly, like a wall losing its mortar, to give. "9 days the Greeks bled without him. Then Patroclus came to Achilles weeping, and asked for the armor. Achilles buckled it onto him himself. Each bronze plate, each silver riveted strap, and watched his friend walk out into the dust of the plain, looking exactly like a man he loved. Hector met him near the Scaean gates. The spear entered below the breastplate. Patroclus went down hard, one knee striking the cracked earth with the wet, percussive weight of something that would not rise again. Hector stripped the bronze from the body. Piece by piece, the messenger ran, found Achilles at the water's edge, spoke. Achilles made no sound. He sat down in the sand, the same cold, and the grief took him the way a wave takes a man who has stopped watching the sea. He was still there when the sun went down. The cold came off the water in slow pulls, and the wet sand had soaked through his chiton to the skin. But Achilles did not move. His face was pressed into his knees, arms locked around his shins, the salt of the sea and the salt of his grief indistinguishable on his jaw. Thetis came up from the dark water without sound. She knelt beside him in the wet sand and put both arms around him and held. She said nothing. There was nothing that could be said. She knew what his return to battle meant. She had always known. Still she held him, her silver hair cold and dripping against his cheek, her hands pressing hard against his back, as though she could keep the grief inside his body by simply refusing to let go. By the next afternoon, the plain was ringed with watching faces. Hector ran, not from cowardice. Everyone on those walls understood that, but because his legs had decided before his chest could stop them. 3 times he circled Troy's stone perimeter, his bronze greaves striking the packed earth, and 3 times Achilles followed, relentless, silent, not even breathing hard. The 4th pass, Hector stopped. He turned. He raised his spear. The 2 men stood still for one suspended moment, the only stillness in the world. Then Achilles drove forward, and the spear found the gap below Hector's gorget, and it was done. High on the walls, Helen gripped the parapet stone, gritstone, rough-edged, cutting into her fingers, and understood. Not Paris, never Paris. Hector had been the city's actual beating heart, its discipline and its mercy both. And now that heart had stopped. Troy was still standing, but it was already gone. "9 days later, Priam walked alone into the dark. He crossed the Greek lines on foot, an old man carrying a ransom in a cedar chest, his white robe gray with road dust, his sandals worn through at the left heel. He found the tent. He went in. Achilles looked up from the low fire and said nothing. Priam knelt. He took the hands that had killed Hector, the knuckles still scraped, the fingers long and cold, and pressed his mouth to them. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said only, "Give me my son back." Achilles sat very still. He thought of his own father, old and waiting by a cold hearth, and the grief split something open in him that the fighting never had. He wept. Priam wept. Two men on opposite sides of the world's worst wound, weeping together over a fire burned down to coals. Before dawn, Achilles gave the order. Days after, Achilles was at the Scaean gates when Paris drew. The arrow left the recurved bow with a sound like a green branch snapping. Apollo's hand was on it, not guiding it toward the chest or the throat, but lower, falling at an angle no archer alone could calculate. It crossed the full width of the afternoon sky and struck the back of Achilles' heel, between the tendon and the bone. He stopped, not the way a man stops when he decides to, the way a lamp stops when the oil is gone. His spear dropped first, the ash shaft ringing once against the stone, and then his knees met the dust of Troy, and then his great shoulders turned slowly toward the sky, as though he were looking for something he had always known would be there. "10 days later, the shore was empty. The ships were gone. The camp was ash and trampled earth, and on the beach, where 10,000 Greeks had slept and bled for a decade, sat a horse, raw timber, unpainted, the height of 4 men, its hollow belly casting a long shadow east across the sand. By afternoon, they had dragged it through the gates. Cassandra stood in the great square and screamed until her voice broke against the stone. She seized Priam's sleeve with both hands, the deep purple wool bunching in her fists, and he looked at her the way a man looks at a fire that has burned in the same hearth for so long he has stopped feeling its heat. Gently he loosened her fingers, one by one. The square filled with torchlight, with singing, with the smell of pine resin and new wine poured on old stone. The horse stood at the center of it all, saying nothing. The singing stopped before midnight. Helen dressed without waking Paris and walked down to the square alone, her bare feet finding the cold seams between the paving stones. The horse was larger in the dark. She pressed her palm flat against its flank, raw timber still faintly warm from the afternoon sun, the grain rough enough to catch the skin. She held very still. Beneath her hand, the faint, unmistakable heat of breathing men. The wood did not move, but the warmth did. She had always known things she could not explain knowing. Her hand stayed against the timber a long moment. Above her, Troy slept, its rooftops silver in the moonlight, its people full of new wine and relief. She stepped back, crossed her arms against the cold night air. Then she turned and walked back through the dark toward the palace. Her footsteps the only sound, and then not even that. An hour later, the screaming began. Helen did not move from the window. Below, the Scaean gates stood open, forced wide from inside, and Greek torches flooded the streets like spilled oil finding every low place. The cedar storerooms caught first, then the stables, then the great temple of Athena, its limestone columns turned amber, then white, then gone behind the smoke. She had known. Her palm had known. The orange light moved across her face, across the floor, across the bed where Paris still slept, until he did not. She heard him rise, heard the door, heard his feet on the corridor stone going away from her. She did not call after him. Outside, a roof beam gave the wet, percussive crack of it carrying up through the hot air. Somewhere below, a child was shouting a name. Then only fire. Helen stood in the window's frame and watched Troy finish becoming the thing it had always been moving toward. Her hands rested open at her sides. She did not weep. She did not run. The heat reached her face like a second sun. He came through the smoke with his sword already drawn. Menelaus moved between burning doorways, past bodies he did not stop to name, until he found her, still standing, the window at her back, the fire behind her making a corona of her hair. He raised the blade. She turned and looked at him. Her face was steady. No plea formed on it, no calculation. Only her eyes, and whatever lived in them that had always defeated reason before he could reach it. The sword arm stayed up a full breath longer. Then it came down. He crossed the room, took her wrist, and turned for the door without a word. Her hand was warm. His was shaking. Neither of them spoke as the ceiling of Troy fell somewhere behind them, and the path to the ships opened through the ash. Not far from where the ships were loading, Cassandra sat among the fallen stones of Troy and did not move. Ash settled on her shoulders. The torn ochre of her robe was gray with it. Around her, the city breathed its last, timber cracking somewhere deep in the rubble, a single column of white smoke rising straight into the windless dawn sky. She had said this, every word of it, the horse, The fire, the silence after. No one had listened. No one had ever listened. She pressed one palm flat against a broken stone, still warm from the night's burning, gritty with ash and pulverized plaster, and she did not weep. The not weeping was its own kind of weight. She had been right about everything, and it had not mattered at all, and now there was nothing left to be right about. The dawn came anyway, pale, indifferent, thorough. Cassandra lifted her face toward it, not in hope, not in accusation, simply because the light was there and she was still here, and the world had ended exactly as she always knew it would.